Hi, everybody. Welcome to another installation of the UCLA Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series. Today, I'm filling in for Professor Brian Wood, who would normally be hosting it this year, who had to be away today. Let me mention a few things. I'd like to announce the talk for next week. So next week, our visitor is from Duke University. Jenny Tung will be talking about the socioecology of the genome, lessons from our primate cousins. So please join us for that next Monday, same time, same place. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome Gerry Carter, who's an assistant professor at Ohio State University in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology. And Gerry is going to be telling us today about his research on cooperative relationships in vampire bats. Please join me in welcoming Gerry. Thanks for visiting us today. And go ahead and get started whenever.
Okay, thank you so much.
I see your presenter view here.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's not showing the same as it did when we tried it out, of course. So try something else. See if we can get it to work
let
again.
me try again.
Try one more time.
Yeah, it was fine before the intro.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't notice that when I started.
One sec. Okay, what am I? Oh wait, sorry. I forgot to share my screen. That's the crucial piece. Let's see. It's giving me the option to just.
Nope.
No.
Be in presenter mode.
Weird.
Oh, that's strange.
Whatever you did last time worked really well.
Yeah.
You did a swap. The swap at the top.
Yeah, I just tried that, but it didn't seem to. Is that better?
That's it.
Yes.
That's it.
Oh, that's worked.
Right there.
Okay,
Yep.
well, who knows what's going on, but okay, so I can I'll go ahead and start now.
Yeah.
I just noticed there's also a typo on my title slide. There's not supposed to be a question mark after cooperative relationships with vampire bats. Hopefully, if I do my job, you'll be convinced that vampire bats have these cooperative relationships. No question mark. So I'll get to the vampire bats in a moment, but I thought I would start off just by talking about cooperation and reciprocity in general, because these are contentious topics that people think about in very different ways. So I thought I would lay out how I think about this. And I think I'll start with this idea of just, cooperation in the big picture scheme of things. And when we think about pinnacles of cooperation, we often think of these cooperative societies, like these eusocial insects, or we might think of cooperation among cells in the body or between genes in the genome. And in all these cases, cooperation can be explained in the broadest terms by these frameworks like inclusive fitness theory or multi-level selection. But I think one of the emerging themes from the last 30 years of empirical work is that cooperative traits are not stabilized by just one thing, like relatedness or spatial assortment. And in particular, many forms of cooperation that should be entirely stable in theory, on paper or in models, are actually still actively enforced by the individuals themselves. And this enforcement occurs at every level, right? So every level of biological organization. So you have selfish genetic elements that are continually evolving and being repressed. Cancer is constantly being repressed in the body. In eusocial insects, altruism is often enforced by this worker policing, where the workers try to lay their own eggs. Their eggs are killed. The individuals doing this can be punished or killed. And so selfish behavior is constantly being regulated. And this is true even when these forces that we know are key drivers of cooperation, like relatedness, even when these things are turned up to 100%. So I think these ants here are clonal ants, and they still do this worker policing. So there's almost no genetic conflict from kinship, but that doesn't always seem to be enough. And so the big question on my mind involves this completely different form of cooperation, where there's way more conflict and complexity within these relationships. These are these friendships or friendship-like relationships that we see in primates, but I think which also occur in other other mammals and birds. And to me, the question is, to what extent is selfish behavior in these relationships being actively regulated by the individuals choosing to invest in more cooperative partners, either across partners or over time in one partner? And this kind of enforcement is originally and famously called reciprocal altruism, or now we usually call it reciprocity, because it's not altruistic in terms of the W.T. Hamilton definition of altruism. And this idea of reciprocity is increasingly controversial, I think since the 90s onwards. And this is the first thing I want to discuss and get out of the way, because a lot of people, when they think about the vampire bat work on cooperation, they link it to this idea of reciprocity. And so they want to know, what's the story of reciprocity? Do the vampire bats do reciprocity? So some authors say that reciprocity is controversial because there's no clear evidence for it. I don't think that's quite right. I think most of the evidence is correlational, which that's certainly the case, but that's also true of nepotism, right? So there's way more studies showing just that helping behavior correlates with kinship than there are studies showing exactly the mechanism of kin recognition, how that drives cooperation. So nobody doubts that kin selection is important, even though most of the data is correlational. So I think it's actually that people have different priors when it comes to reciprocity. I think there's 4 reasons for this, sort of historically going back into the literature. And one is that when we think about reciprocity, we think about these game theory models of cooperation, and they're very categorical. And so I think this leads to this false dichotomy in the literature when we think about reciprocity. So it leads to people thinking about categorizing cooperation as either reciprocity or this other thing, often called pseudo-reciprocity. So reciprocity is when you have cooperation that's stabilized by conditional investments. And these investments have to be conditional because there's a lot of conflict in the relationship. So for instance, if reciprocity explains this grooming interaction, it would mean that this individual here is investing in grooming, investing time and energy in grooming. And if this individual doesn't respond in the correct way, then this individual is worse off than if it had never done this. It's making an investment that it's trying to get a return from. And if it doesn't get a return from that investment, it's even worse off. And so this is the way this is modeled is through the prisoner's dilemma. And pseudo-reciprocity is the idea that cooperation is inherently stable because there might not always be a return, but over time, the net returns, there's going to be an inevitable net positive return. And so this just means that there's less inherent conflict in the relationship. And there's many games that can describe this, but for instance, the Snowdrift game is an example where there's just less conflict than in the prisoner's dilemma. So basically, it might always make sense for this individual to groom this individual, regardless of how this individual behaves. And so another way to think about this is that reciprocity assumes that there's this risk, there's an investment, and that investment is going to cause investment from A to B causes investment from B to A. Whereas a pseudo-reciprocity idea is that A makes an investment in B, and this just creates this inevitable return from B back to A. And I have never really liked this framing of things because this is like a binary choice, and obviously relationships lie along this continuous spectrum. And when you form a relationship, you're essentially moving along that spectrum. So as a social relationship develops, the game payoffs are not just suddenly going to shift from one to the other, they're going to change gradually. And I have been thinking about this since graduate school, but nobody had really laid this out in the literature until this, at least I didn't see this, stated very explicitly in these terms. Redwin Basheri wrote this paper, which I think makes this point really clear. Most mutual helping in most natural systems is neither conflict-free nor maximal conflict. So these games that we think about are actually and often there are these extreme endpoints where we don't imagine a lot of these relationships, where a lot of these relationships shouldn't actually exist in these spaces. And so what's useful is to think about this as a continuous spectrum where you have high conflict and you have low conflict, and having a factor that's a continuous variable. So this is the concept of interdependence, which is introduced by Gilbert Roberts in 2005, becoming increasingly popular as an important concept since then. But basically, it's replacing the idea of pseudo-reciprocity, which is a categorical thing, with something that you can turn up. You turn up this dial, and the amount of conflict goes down. And I also think reciprocity should be thought of as that way. Reciprocity is not necessarily just a categorical hypothesis. It's a kind of responsiveness that you can turn up like a dial. And so historically in the literature, we've often argued about what game is being played by the animal. So you've got predator inspection in fish. Is it a prisoner's dilemma? Is it a snowdrift game? Which game is it? And people tend not to be able to actually resolve this because it's difficult to figure out what games the animals are playing in their minds, how they perceive the situation. But with this concept of interdependence, we can picture that there's actually this full continuous spectrum between these points. And the important point here is that when relationships are forming, we might imagine that the players of these games are moving along this spectrum. And the other point I want to make about reciprocity is that many people define reciprocity based on the cost and benefits, and is it a prisoner's dilemma or not? But many people also define reciprocity in a different way, which is just to say, is the helping behavior conditional, or is there contingency? Does A help B because B helps A? And if so, then it's reciprocity. And that idea of contingency doesn't actually overlay perfectly on top of the prisoner's dilemma, because you can have contingency in a prisoner's dilemma, or you can have contingency in a snowdrift game. And so what you basically have is people who define reciprocity based on the underlying game have a narrower definition than people who define reciprocity based on the behavior that you can observe. And this leads to a lot of the disagreement that you see in the literature, where some people are saying there's no evidence of reciprocity anywhere, and other people are saying reciprocity is extremely important. Much of this is a semantic thing. The other reason I think that reciprocity is controversial is because it's often thought of as this all-encompassing explanation. But there are really, I think it's better to think about it as a factor. There are many potential factors that are all occurring at the same time that could be driving decision to help, or could be working together synergistically to make a trait stable. And I think we just don't really have a good understanding of the relative importance of all of these factors. So just for instance, when we think about reciprocity and we want to test it, we might only look at recent social interactions, but then there's the long-term history, and then there's kinship. And kinship and reciprocity could be working together, right? So reciprocity is often tested in non-kin, but it could be that it's the best place to look for it is in, why is it that one individual who's got two equally related sisters favors one sister over another? Maybe it's because that sister reciprocates more than this one. And so even though the relatedness is equal, there's still this reason to have variation. Maybe there could be reciprocity hidden in families, for instance. Dominance can play a relationship, right? And that can play a role. Maybe this individual's decision is being influenced by the marketplace of other available partners. Maybe this individual's investment in different relationships depends on what it has experienced with other partners. And that's called generalized reciprocity. Maybe certain individuals just have, different amounts of cooperativeness that drives. Maybe there's just very individual variation, which also makes this all harder to understand. And then there's also interactions between these things. So maybe some individuals do more reciprocity than other individuals. So all of these things could be happening at the same time. And so to understand these things, I think we really have to experimentally manipulate these effects while holding other ones constant. And that's difficult when you're talking about these social bonds, because social bonds implies stability, and they are by definition stable. So you're trying to manipulate something that's stable. And so this leads to my third reason why I think reciprocity is a controversial topic, is that it's just not very easy to study, because when you're talking about reciprocity in a long-term relationship, if you have a stable relationship, it's a very difficult thing to manipulate. So you could focus on trying to manipulate weak relationships, but weak relationships are very difficult to measure. So the individuals are not going to help each other as much, which means it's more difficult to precisely measure the helping rates that you're trying to estimate. So this is why I think reciprocity is controversial. These game theory models present these sort of false dichotomies. There's a lot of semantic confusion in literature. It's not just the things I mentioned, it's also things like some people think of reciprocity as something that's really cognitively difficult, and other people think about reciprocity as something that plants and fungi do. That's all semantic. So there's already that as a backdrop. Then I think you just can't actually answer this with observational data because you have to manipulate the interactions to understand causality. You can get at it, but I think it'll be difficult to make a demonstration that convinces everybody. And like I said, it's hard to test when you have these long-term bonds because presumably the animals are integrating larger windows of time than just what happened yesterday or even in the previous hour or something. So what I want to try to convince you of in this talk is that I think vampire bats have a really strong potential role to play in terms of being able to measure and manipulate their interactions and their entire relationships in ways that have been difficult with primates, for instance. And one of the reasons for this is that vampire bats live in these really enclosed spaces. So they might spend their entire social life, or not their entire social life, but much of their social life inside of a space that you can simulate in the lab, like a space that's the size of a small closet and it's in the dark. And so we can put them in the lab and they will do all the same stuff. The grooming and the food sharing all happens in these very enclosed spaces. And they're small animals. So you can just work with them easier for that reason. They're kind of like rats that act a bit more like primates. And they have this food sharing behavior, which this is to explain this, I should say that vampire bats feed on nothing but blood. They get one meal a night. They can starve to death after 3 nights without food. And so this food sharing behavior is probably linked to this. Bats that fail to feed, which happens really often with the younger bats and still happens with the adults, can come back to the roost, and other bats will often regurgitate a portion of their blood meals to feed them. And all mothers do this for their offspring, but also it happens between non-kin. And this was originally studied by Gerry Wilkinson during his PhD in 1970s and 80s. And he basically described this food sharing behavior, showed that it's correlated with kinship. It's correlated with roost switching, which is something that we now call fission-fusion dynamics. This didn't exist as a concept back in the late 1970s, but this is essentially what vampire bats do. They have these groups. The groups break apart and recombine, and there's a lot of the social structure is very fluid, and there's a lot of this mixing of different individuals. Kinship within these groups is relatively low, but there's high variance because there's multiple matrilines, grandmother, mother, daughter. And so the bats that are switching into the same roost together repeatedly over time, these are the ones that are sharing food with each other. And this is true even when you control for kinship. Gerry Wilkinson, 1980s, did an experiment where he took unrelated individuals, brought them into captivity. These were individuals that had high levels of association, but were unrelated. And then he found that they shared food in a reciprocal pattern. And this was his original evidence for reciprocity, which people then basically criticized from the early 90s up until I started my PhD. And the other thing here that's often lost with this story is that the vampire bats provided this evidence that they're helping each other in a reciprocal fashion, but it was also very obvious that they were nepotistic and that they were helping kin. And so this is an example of how you can have nepotism and reciprocity co-occurring in the same group. And we don't have to think of these things as alternative explanations. And I think that point is one of the more important points of this paper, but people tended to focus on the reciprocal altruism idea, which was fairly new at the time. So Axelrod and Hamilton had published their famous Evolution of Cooperation paper in 1981. So this was within the couple of years later. And so this story of vampire bat reciprocal altruism got picked up by all kinds of popular books and science books. And this is where I first learned about this as an undergraduate, became like obsessed with this idea of vampire bat reciprocity, which led me to want to revisit this during my PhD, which I did. And it was a good time because there was this growing skepticism about the original story. So there was a lot of skepticism about reciprocity in general. And then there was a lot of skepticism about the vampire bat story in particular. So there was all these alternative explanations. Several people have made models showing that you don't need reciprocity in vampire bats to have this be stable. People pointed out that Gerry Wilkinson never really showed that there was any contingency. people pointed out there's actually very few observations in his original Nature paper, and 95% of the sharing that he saw in the wild was among close kin. So people thought maybe this is just artifact of the bats being in captivity or small sample size, and this is just kin selection, and bats just are kind of because of signal detection theory, they're biasing themselves to accidentally feed some individuals that might be related to them, and that could also explain the results. So when I did my PhD, my goal was to try to test all of these alternatives and revisit this story. And I never really stopped working on this question. I just kind of got deeper and deeper, and I've just been working on cooperation of vampire bats since then. And so over time, the data I'm going to show you come from different captive colonies. I've had 6 different captive colonies. This is over 1,200 of these food sharing trials where we pull a bat out, we fast it as if it had missed a meal, and we put it back in and we see who feeds it. And then we can get estimates of kinship, either from a maternal pedigree or from, and usually it's both. We have a maternal pedigree, and then we also have microsatellite markers to get it relatedness estimates. And the idea here is that we're really simulating the composition of natural roosts. So we never have kinship structures that are unnatural. And so this is what these fasting trials look like. So the bats are in there, I pull a bat out, make it hungry, I put it back in, and then we videotape what happens, and then they do this little belly-to-belly mouth licking thing that you see here. And when we measure these mouth licking events, they correlate with the weight that this bat gains. And so we use the seconds of mouth licking as an estimate of how much food it got from different individuals. And this is useful. It's useful that we have the Wilkinson data from the field to sort of show that this is something that happens in the wild, and it has consequences for their fitness, but it's also something that we can really manipulate in the lab, because we can make it happen as many times as we need to, and we can manipulate it in other ways. So for instance, we can force them to share food under conditions where it's more risky. We can put a bat on the ground, we shine light on it, still see if bats will still come down to feed it. This shows, for instance, that this is not caused by harassment, like it's something that has been proposed for primates. There's all kinds of little things we can do to try to manipulate their interactions, trying to explore different ways we could do that. So intranasal oxytocin seems to be one way. We can increase social grooming. We can make bats interact with each other less by challenging their immune system, so they get sick and lethargic, and so then they will groom each other less. And so the question I've been trying to get at for a long time is, why do vampire bats share food? Is it reciprocity? Is it is it actually kin selection byproduct? These are the different main ideas. So there's indirect fitness benefits, it's reciprocity. There is fitness interdependence, which is this idea that the bats just their fitness is inherently correlated for some unspecified reason, or is it all of the above? And I think it's all of the above. And I'll just go through and try to explain why I think all of these things are playing some role here. The first thing to understand about food sharing is that it's really a trait that's co-opted from maternal care. So like I said, all the mothers feed their offspring, and they make a huge investment in their offspring. So compared to other bats, they have 1 pup a year. Their gestation period is about 7 months, which is really long for a bat of their size. It's a 30-gram animal. They nurse for 10 months, 3 times longer than other neotropical bats. They carry around this infant that's like half their mass. And so they have high investment, small litter size, slow reproduction, really long lifespan. They can live 30 years in captivity. And there's records of them living 17 years in the wild. So this is a food sharing behavior this food sharing behavior is something that is essentially an extension of maternal care. But like I said, it's not just among mothers and offspring. So if you look at food sharing networks over a long span of time, that's what I'm showing you here. This is 4 years of the food sharing rates, which is the width of these arrows, from each bat to every other bat. The red nodes are the females, the blue nodes are the males. You can see that most of the food sharing is among the females. The males sometimes feed the females sometimes feed the males. I've only seen males feeding males once. But I've also focused way more on the females than the males. I basically stopped studying the males. because the females are actually the individuals that have these like long-term enduring relationships, whereas males, when they reach reproductive age, they leave their natal group. There's a lot of, it's mostly they're competing with each other over territories. But if you look at what's the best predictor of how much bat A feeds bat B, it's how much bat B feeds bat A. And kinship plays a role. Familiarity obviously plays a role. There's other factors involved. It's hard to weigh all these things against each other, but this is a result that seems to come back over and over again. Other ways that you can show this to try to disentangle this from kinship is, for instance, if you play calls from a bat that has been a high donor of this subject here versus bats that have been a low donor, there's a very strong response towards the high donor, even when neither of these individuals are related to this individual. But if you do the opposite and you play calls from close kin and non-kin where neither have been food donors, and the fact that that even exists is an example of how these things aren't completely, they're not completely confounded. You don't see a strong bias towards kin over non-kin without this experience of these cooperative interactions. So a better way to maybe think about these networks is to pull out one individual and say, okay, well, what does this individual's donor network look like? And because these relationships tend to be reciprocal, who donates to a bat tends to be predicted by who the bat helps. And basically what you see is that if you have a female and she has a pup, she's gonna feed that pup all the time. And the pup grows up. If it's a daughter, it stays in the group. If it's a son, it'll leave. If it's a daughter, this relationship basically extends into a relationship, into adulthood. And the daughters begin feeding their mothers when their mothers grow up. And this can happen pretty early. So when the daughters are still nursing from the mom, they will also be taking blood and they will regurgitate food to their mother that is still taking care of them. So this symmetry develops pretty quickly. And then there's also these relationships between distant kin. And like I said, these relationships exist between non-kin. Then you have these weaker relationships, which often are an exception to these symmetrical relationships. They're going in one direction, but it's not clear if they're going in one direction because they're just undersampled because the helping rates are low, or if these are actually unidirectional. But I'll get to those in a moment. So one question that comes up is if these bats can have these symmetrical helping relationships with both kin and non-kin, why bother having them with non-kin at all? Why not just build relationships with kin? What's the point of these relationships over here? Are these mistakes, or are these some attempt for this bat to like have a larger donor network? One thing that's a bit interesting is that this is a pretty small sample size, but this is, I think, an interesting observation nonetheless, that if you look across bats, so these are data from 14, 15, I think 14 female bats over a 4-year period, their donation rates are pretty different from each other. And the number of non-kin that they feed differs. So this individual here has never fed an unrelated individual, whereas this one has fed 9 out of the 14 bats that she's unrelated to. And you can think of this as the bats that these individuals are choosing to feed, but they also have this family that they're born into of different sizes, right? So if they have a mother daughter, they're going to share food with that mother daughter. This is the red bars here. There's a number of close kin. This is really close maternal kin. And this they don't really have control over. So they might have a mother in the group or not. And there are bats that don't have mothers in the group in the wild because females will actually move into a group. We don't know why they left their previous group, but every couple of years, females will just show up in a group and then they're unrelated to anybody. And so one question rather is there this trade-off between the quantity and the quality of relationships? Are there bats that are trying to build more relationships or other bats are trying to build stronger relationships? And is there some kind of, you can't have both situation? And so one way to look at this is just see how well these bats do that have these different kinds of bonds, because the bats that have fewer relationships do tend to have strong, those relationships tend to be stronger for those bats. So one hypothesis is that fewer non-kin donations is better. So these bats are just doing it correctly, and that these ones that are feeding only their family are they are just doing proper nepotistic helping, and these ones are just making mistakes. Perhaps they don't know who their relatives are, and so they're not sure, and they're extending their food sharing out too much. Could be errors in kin recognition, for instance. Another possibility is the opposite, which is that these bats are doing it correctly. What you want to have is just the biggest network possible, and these ones just can't have a big network for whatever reason. They're not good at gaining relationships, and so they're just stuck with their family. And then another hypothesis is that the best strategy depends on social stability. So maybe you have bats that are doing these different things, and that more is better under certain circumstances. So more might be better, for instance, if the social environment is less stable. So if your main donors go missing, then maybe this is better. But if your main donors are always there for you, if your mother's always there for you, then maybe it's best just to have a strong relationship with your mother. But if your mother can disappear, then maybe you need to have other relationships outside. So I called this social bet hedging. I'm not sure if I like that term anymore. It's kind of a weird idea, but it's basically a diversifying strategy, right? Bats, and the idea here is that bats are investing in these non-kin bonds to buffer against the potential loss of kin, and they're diversifying their partner investments. And so one way to test that is to, basically make a situation where you lose your primary donors. So that's what we did, was we removed the primary donor, key donor, for a focal bat. And then as a control, we removed a bat that had never fed this bat. And I'm going to show you the mean food received on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, I'm showing you where the bats lie along the spectrum of investing a lot in non-kin versus not investing much in non-kin. And so if fewer is better, this is what you basically predict. The bats that have these smaller networks are going to do better under both conditions. If more is better, then the bats should do better. The bats that have larger networks should do better under both conditions. And if social bet hedging is correct, then essentially there's going to be a benefit to having more partners, but under this situation where the key donor is removed. And then this benefit is going to be hidden when under normal circumstances. You're not going to see this benefit. So this is actually what we found. So under normal circumstances, females that helped more non-kin did not receive more food. So this line is not going up as far as we can tell from this sample of bats. But when we removed their key donor, females that helped more non-kin did receive more food. And another way to think about that is that they coped better with the loss of an individual in their donor network. So this is the amount of food that they lost when we took away the key donor, and the bats over here are not they're not losing any food really, because those individuals that we took away are just replaced by other individuals that step in, and those individuals tend to be the individuals that this bat has been feeding in previous years. These unrelated partners that it's essentially created these relationships by feeding these individuals. So when primary donors usually can go missing, non-kin partners can provide these backup donors. And so this is a benefit that you wouldn't necessarily see unless you've done this manipulation. So since this paper came out, I've seen more evidence, at least for this trade-off between quality and quantity of relationships. So this is actually in the supplement of this paper on grooming and just social bond networks and on fitness consequences for macaques. There is this evidence for a trade-off between quality and quantity of bonds. And the same thing with these mannequins, lance-tailed mannequins. Another observation that's consistent with this idea of animals regulating their relationships is that when individuals lose relationships, there's evidence that they try to replace those. So if you're a female baboon and your mother is eaten by a hyena, you might start grooming individuals you've never groomed before and grooming more. And this has also been seen in the great tits at Whiteham Woods. So basically what I like about this social bet hedging idea is that it's sort of It's the other part of this equation when we think about networks and social bonds. We're often thinking about how the social network influences the success of the individual. And this has been shown in a number of different species now, that the quality and the quantity of relationships are really important for health, survival, reproduction, well-being. And the other side to this is, how does the individual's behavior place it in the network, right? So, there's ways that their placement in the network could be out of their control, and they could be passively acquiring or inheriting their position in the network. So for instance, they might inherit relationships from their mother. If their mother's highly connected, those relationships might pass down to an individual. The same thing could happen when an individual dies. And I think we really don't know that much about the extent to which animals are basically social networking as a verb, how they're making decisions about should they form new relationships or invest in existing ones, or should they strengthen existing ones, or when should they switch. So that's what I'm trying to get at with the vampire bats. One of the big questions that I think that I'm excited about and think we're making progress on is, how do new relationships form, right? So this question was answered theoretically by this paper from 1998 called Development of Cooperative Relationships. And it's often called raising the stakes or testing the waters. And it's essentially the idea that individuals who want to start new relationships should make small cooperative investments at first, and then gradually increase them in partners that provide returns. And this is something that humans will do in sort of economic style public good games. But it's difficult to study nature because you have to be there when the individuals first meet. And people who have looked at this tend to look at it in terms of, for instance, do I groom you increasingly over time? By measuring things like how much time does an individual help another individual. But another way to look at it is trying to lay out different behaviors that vary in cost. So for instance, clustering is not, that's something that has immediate social benefit. If you're clustering for warmth, that has immediate benefit to you and the partner. It's not really something you're going out of your way to give something to another individual. Grooming is going to be lower cost than food sharing. And so what you might expect is that there is a kind of testing the waters by transitioning across different kinds of cooperative behavior. So I haven't talked about social grooming in vampire bats, but I'll just say that this is about grooming itself. And bats that are grooming themselves are several times more likely to be groomed by other bats. They also groom bats that when we put bands on them, they groom the bands. We mess up their fur, they'll groom bats. So they're at least responsive to what seem like cues of need in other individuals. And this is something that vampire bats do and other bats don't do. So the food sharing and the social grooming are both special for vampire bats. These are social grooming rates for bats kept under identical conditions, all in captivity, no ectoparasites. They're all in the same like little bat zoo. And you can just see here the vampire bats groom each other way more. Females spend 5% of their active time grooming each other. This number is lower because it includes males, which don't groom each other as much. So what we basically predict is that strangers would build up to food sharing by developing grooming relationships that they escalate, reciprocal grooming relationships that lead into reciprocal sharing relationships. So to do this, we need strangers. So we grab bats from different parts of Panama, hundreds of kilometers apart. So we know that they don't know each other and we know that they're unrelated. We put them in captivity together. We did these controlled introductions. Sometimes we introduced one bat to 3. Sometimes we put them in isolated pairs, where we just are kind of finishing a study that we haven't published yet, which basically shows that we cannot predict the long-term relationship outcomes from the first 6 hours of how they interact, which I'll explain what that means later. But basically, this relationship formation is not something that happens right away. It's not something that we can predict right away. This is a long period of time that we're collecting data on these bats. So we measured their existing relationships with the main group for 6 months. Then we had these bats are going to be the strangers that we introduced. We put them together either in isolated pairs or in these quartets where one were introduced to an in-group of 3. And then we mashed everybody together So there's in-group and out-group here. During this time, there was 13 bats that were also born into the study colony. And we also looked at how those bats formed new relationships with individuals in the group. This is over 11 months here, looking at these are the first food donations. So we gave all the bats food, but then selected certain bats to not get food, and then who fed them, because they had never, we don't know if this is the absolute first time that the bats received food from another bat, but we know it's the first time the bats had to receive food from another bat. It's the first time that they just didn't have access to food and therefore really needed this food donation. And you can see that these first food donations are occurring at very different points in time. Some of them are happening much later than others. One of the predictions from the raising the stakes model is that if you look at which bats form food sharing relationships and which ones don't, they should have different grooming rate trajectories over time. So the ones that are sharing food later, they should have grooming that is increasing over time, whereas these ones should have grooming that is potentially increasing over time, but not as much. And so we just basically looked at, on a daily basis, what's the probability of being groomed before food sharing ever happens. And this is consistent with the prediction that the bats that share food sharing relationships the grooming relationships are increasing over time. And this is in the reciprocal direction. Grooming is so reciprocal that if I made this plot for B to A or A to B, it's going to look the same. And I should just say that we also replicated this in 2019 with even more new pairs. So I feel comfortable with this result. Another thing we did was line up every relationship with a day 0, which is the first donation from bat A to bat B, and then ask, was the grooming rate from B to A going up before then, but not after? Because you shouldn't be needing to increase your grooming rate after you're already food sharing. And this too was consistent with the prediction that the rates are increasing before, but not after. And also these relationships should emerge in this reciprocal pattern where bat A feeds bat B, and this makes it more likely then that bat B is going to feed bat A. And that also was the case controlling for kinship. The only kinship that could have played a role here was the captive born bats, because they were related to some of the individuals that they were forming relationships with, but kinship couldn't play a role with all of the other new pairs. We also made this prediction that bats that didn't have alternative outside options would form relationships faster than bats that had many individuals that they already had relationships with. These bats under these conditions should form relationships faster. And this is, again, what we saw. Now, we had a pretty small sample size here, and also this experiment just wasn't done that well, to be honest. I mean, these controlled introductions were kind of they were kind of spread out over time. The bats were in there for different periods of time, and we didn't have the baseline relationships after. So we built on this experiment and basically did it again in a much cleaner way. And this time we actually really measured the effect of being stuck together in this pair. And this is something my PhD student did in 2019. He's basically trying to do what I've been failing to do since my PhD, which is to actually test partner choice by manipulating the relationship, by manipulating the interactions directly. So in 2019, he did a test of just isolating the effect of being placed together. And just now, like a few days ago, he went down to Panama and he's going to do this partner choice test that hopefully will give us some interesting insights. But I'll show you the experiment he did in 2019. So same basic idea, put bats together from 3 sites rather than 2 sites, and basically measure their grooming relationships over a period of 6 weeks, then force certain bats together into little triads here, and then look at what happens after they could all freely associate again. Look at their grooming relationships after. And basically the prediction here is that you've got 3 different kinds of dyads. So you've got familiar pairs, so they already knew each other before. Those relationships shouldn't be getting stronger because they already have a social history with each other and they've already developed the relationships that they're going to develop. Then there are the pairs that are new, but were not forced together. We expect those relationships to increase, but not as much as the ones where we forced them together, where they could only associate with each other during this period of a week. And so what I'm going to show you is the change going from the pre-treatment to the post-treatment period. And again, this is consistent with the prediction that when you force these bats together and then release them, there's a stickiness to those elevated associations lead to these bats having relationships that continue even after we no longer force them together. So this is what this looks like over time. So here's the control dyads and the test dyads, their grooming rates over time. And then we've got these bats, we force them together into little triads. And then afterwards, you can see here that the test dyads now their grooming rates are elevated above the controlled dyads. So bats are forced into proximity, develop these persistent social bonds. You can think of this as like what happens with college dorm rooms, where people studied the fact that if you share a dorm room with an individual, you're way more likely to have a relationship that persists even after college because you're essentially forced together. But what we really want to do is go and look within those dyads. Is the bond formation being affected by, is it being driven by the fact that they're forced together? Is it being driven by being forced together makes you groom each other more, which then makes you have a stronger relationship? So that would be the reciprocity. And essentially what we get from this is we can't quite see that. So the effect is going in the right direction. It's just not strong enough because our sample size here for the grooming is only the 21 bats that were together. So this is why we're doing a stronger version of this test. So I'd say it's inconclusive. We can't identify whether this effect was the proximity effect or what's happening when you're in proximity. The fact that grooming was also elevated in addition to association. I'll sort of step back a bit and just talk about other evidence that the forced proximity creates enduring social bonds. So one comes from this study where we captured bats from the wild. We had them in captivity. This is the same group I talked about before where we looked at relationship formation. But the other thing we could look at is not just forming new relationships, but the relationships that the bats already had. We could see those relationships becoming stronger in captivity. Within certain dyads, the cooperation increased in captivity. So we had all of this food sharing and grooming data. They were together for 21 months. When we released them back into the wild, we put little tracking devices on them, proximity sensors, which allowed us to then reconstruct their proximity networks when they were in the field. And basically what we wanted to know was whether the bats would reform the same social networks that they had in the lab, but back in the wild where they had the option of associating not only with these 20 to 30 individuals, but with 200, 300 individuals. So we put them back into the tree where we captured them. And this roost inside this tree, oh, I thought I had a video of it, but maybe I don't, I took it out. There's many bats in this tree. There's many other bats. As a control group, we took some of those bats. There's somewhere between 200 and 300 bats inside the tree. We took a control group of those bats and put the same proximity sensors on them. The other nice thing about these sensors is that we could look at their associations not only inside the roost, which is everything we know about these bats is really inside of these, what they're doing when they're in a roost. We don't know much about what they're doing for the hour or 2 hours that they're outside the roost. And so we could also look at that, and I'll show you what we've learned about that in a sec. But inside the roost, the bats are in there. We took little peeks, we took little photos. We could actually see already that they were clustering with the bats that they had been in jail with, essentially, the ones that were in captivity together. Essentially, we could see them staying together. When we looked at the social networks of association, here you can see the orange bats, or the bats that were in captivity together, the blue bats are the control bats. They roosted closest with the bats that they groomed and shared food with in captivity. And it tended to be that the bats that were in closest proximity in the wild were the ones that were sharing food the most in captivity. These are the effects. Here I've summarized it as just, this is the effect on each of the different days. So there's 8 days that these loggers stayed on the bats. The first one fell off after 8 days, and so we just stopped collecting data then. But but basically, yeah, these are the effects of food sharing and grooming on predicting the roosting proximity, controlling for kinship. All these things were detected. Yeah, so they do have relationships that are not just an artifact of the lab. There's real stickiness to their relationships. So this idea of this partner fidelity, I think, is something that is now pretty demonstrated. And the way they form these new relationships, I think, is by testing the waters with mutual social grooming, because you get immediate feedback with social grooming. If you feed an individual, you don't know if they're going to feed you back. But if you groom an individual, either they start grooming you back immediately or not. Most of the grooming in vampire bats is at the same time. They're both grooming each other at the same time. And so this is a useful way to sort of assess a partner, I think. These non-kin relationships are not explained by mere phenotypic similarity. So if that was the case, then when we put the bats first together in those first 6 hours, we should see that, oh yeah, they like each other or they don't. It's all very fast because they smell each other and they smell similar, and that's what it's based on. But we don't see any evidence for that. And the possibility for outside options matters. And that, again, you should see the most new relationship formation in the mashing the two groups together, if it's just something like whether you smell like me. So these are ideas that people have put forth in the literature. I think we can reject these ideas now. And this forced proximity leads to longer term social preferences, but really what we need to do is do that kind of experiment, but with the interaction rates specifically at the dyad level, and not just effective proximity. I think we can rule out a bunch of alternative explanations, which basically, that non-kin sharing is just a byproduct of kin selection. I think we can rule that out. It's not just based on harassment. It's not just bats trying to build a larger network. It's really, these are individualized investments. They're not just investments in the whole group. The fitness interdependence is always going to be difficult to test because there's so many different ways that it could occur. There are some models that are consistent with the data and others that are not. I think it's almost certainly the case that there's some degree of fitness interdependence that develops as the bats form relationships, but how exactly you test that experimentally is, I don't know, it's a very difficult thing. So if anyone has ideas, let me know. Reciprocity is nice because it has a testable prediction if you define it as the contingency, but fitness interdependence is difficult. There's so many ways that it could occur. So what I think is happening in the evolution of food sharing, this is the part where I start doing this like hand waving of like how I think this evolved, even though I don't know if we'll ever really be able to know this. But what I see in the pattern of food sharing, it gives me some ideas about maybe what happened during the revolutionary history. So I think this is a process of co-option. So I think the females are helping their offspring. That's just parental care. There's nothing maternal care. There's nothing special about that. There's nothing special about kin helping each other in both directions. Kinship is symmetrical. You can get symmetrical helping just through nepotism. And I think where you can begin to get reciprocity, and we haven't shown this yet, but this is something that I think we could show once we get enough related dyads, and really the ability to try to, we just need way more dyads. But essentially, you have situations where bat has two relatives, and this is where I think reciprocity can piggyback on top of nepotism, because you have two sisters you're equally related to. Do you favor a sister that is more cooperative with you than a sister that's less? Once you get that going, once you get a bias based on social experience, that bias can then spill over to helping bats that help you, even if they're less related to you or unrelated to you. And once you have a system of reciprocity where you're making investments in relationships, those relationships provide returns back to you, it can then make sense to try to develop new relationships because of this process of social bet hedging, of trying to manage both the quality and the quantity of your relationships. And so sometimes you might be extending donations to other individuals to try to create relationships, especially if you sense that you need to have a wider network. Again, the last couple minutes, sorry, this talk is still going, but last couple minutes, I just want to give you some glimpses of the other things we're working on right now. So I told you about these roosting networks and these captive cooperation networks and how we can correlate those with each other and look at those, but we're also looking at these foraging networks. And this says impressed, but this is actually published like last year. So we've started looking at social foraging in vampire bats, and basically they don't forage as a group, but they meet up on the cattle and they can compete or affiliate peacefully. So the same two bats can feed peacefully on the same wound, or they can fight over the wound. And the associations when they're foraging are predicted by their within roost relationships and their grooming and food sharing. So all those things are correlated with each other. And so this is a thing we want to look at more. We think that these interactions are mediated by these calls that they make. There's special calls that I was excited to see. I've been looking at vampire bat contact calls in captivity for years, and I had just never seen these calls before. When we were getting these calls back of these bats basically on the cows, we could see these calls that were clearly correlated with aggression. So when they're fighting, they make these calls that look like the kinds of calls that bats make when they fight with each other. Like they're very atonal, sort of low frequency. So for a bat, they're low frequency. There's little screech calls. And then we see these weird calls that, I don't know, I think these might have something to do with coordinating foraging or something. We're also, I'm just kind of taking real quick through some things we're doing. We're trying to see if there's actual vocal convergence when bats form new relationships. We're doing this right now. So maybe vampire bats are vocal learners. We don't know. We're trying to explain individual variation in cooperativeness of bats by looking at oxytocin and vasopressin receptor densities in brains. And this is with Alex Ophir and Angela Freeman, who were both at Cornell, but Angela's now a PI at Salisbury University. And we don't have these data yet. So I can't tell you anything about that. But finally, I am using this bat-cow network. I want to expand on this to study transmission of these pathogens. You might imagine that around this time, a lot of people are interested in pathogens spilling over from bats to humans for some reason. But vampire bats are the best example of this because they are the main reservoir for rabies, and they're continuously biting livestock. They bite people. They'll bite many different kinds of animals. So they'll bite people. Like I said, I mean, here's a vampire bat on a cougar. There's a vampire bat attacking a penguin. So they're attacking this wildlife. They're attacking livestock, and they are spreading rabies to these animals. And what we want to do is basically make maps of the bats' contacts with these different animals, and then correlate that with the pathogens that we detect in those same individuals, and see if we can actually track the transmission of these pathogens from vampire bats to livestock, from vampire bats to other bats that they roost with. For instance, they roost with these fruit bats in the same roost. And are these vampire bats spreading pathogens to these fruit bats or vice versa? So that's what we just wrote a grant to look at this. And I'm pretty excited about this because it's a whole different new field for me. The field of infectious disease ecology is all new to me. So I'm learning lots of new things. And I'll leave it at that and just say that there's way too many people for me to thank by name, but they're all here on this slide, or not all of them, some of them are on this slide. And I'll thank my funders, and I'll take your questions now if anybody has questions.
All right. Thanks, Gerry, for a fantastic talk. Super interesting. Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions. So if people want to raise your hand, the easiest thing to do is I believe it's under reactions these days. There's a raise hand option. And I can keep a list. Dan.
So thanks. That's really fascinating stuff. A couple of questions. Well, a question and an idea. So the question is, these are remarkably long-lived animals for such small mammals. And I'm curious whether, well, I'm sure you've thought about it, but I'm curious what you see as the relationships between their social dependence and their longevity, and whether there's coevolution in the two characteristics of the species.
Yeah, it's I have thought about this and written about this, but I'm not sure if I have anything amazing to say. I think it's difficult to get at because it's also, these things are all confounded with each other, right? So the fact that the bats are such they make such high investments in their offspring, that also, it's hard to know what the causal arrows are from long-term cooperative relationships and longevity, and these life history strategy traits all sort of correlate with each other. And I guess I haven't thought much about what the causal arrows would be, but yeah, I mean, there's several traits they have that are consistent with expecting long lifespan. Then of course they're bats, which are in general bats are special among mammals in terms of how long they live for how small they are. And one of the explanations for that is hibernation, but vampire bats don't hibernate. Although there's some uncertainty about that. So Gerry Wilkinson, who's the other person who studies social behavior in vampire bats, my PhD advisor, I think there's a couple of things where I've said one thing, he said a separate thing. We need to talk to each other because I'm not sure who's right. So he thinks that vampire bats use torpor, and that might be the case, and I'm not sure. Another one that he thinks that he could be right, or but I'm not sure why he thinks this, is that one of the key predictions for longevity of vampire bats is that the females should be living a long time, but the males should be dropping dead all the time because they don't have these food sharing relationships. But when I've looked into literature on vampire bat longevity, I haven't seen any clear sign that the males are all, not living very long. There's a data set in Argentina, like decades of data, and you've got these males living a really long time. And so it's made me question whether the story as we currently tell it, which is that vampire bat food sharing is mostly about survival, maybe it's actually mostly about the energetics of the fact that females are making such huge investments. And maybe it's more about reproductive success than it is about survival. So I don't know. That's all unknown.
That sparks another question. Do the males have the same variance in their daily foraging success that the females have? That is, are they subject to the same production risk that females do? Because if they do and they don't share, then the sharing can't be managing the production risk, right?
Yeah, and that's just unclear. I don't think we have enough data on. I think basically Gerry Wilkinson in his field data, he didn't find any predictor of foraging success besides age. So when they're young, they're missing a meal every like 3 days, and when they're older, they're missing a meal like every couple of weeks. But again, you just need way more data to really tease that out, to see if there's some bats that are just better foragers than others, and maybe those bats are also sought out as food sharing partners. That's all still unclear.
Okay. So the other thought I had, and I don't know whether this is practically possible, and I don't know if it's ethically acceptable either, but that's to create cheaters, right? That is to, if you somehow, can put little muzzles on them or something so that they, or treat them with an anti-emesis medication so that they can't regurgitate blood meals, what happens in the trajectory of their social relationships?
Yeah, so I've thought about this so much. I mean, I've tried so many different things. I mean, I did these experiments trying to first figure out whether they can tell who can feed them. So I put like a bunch of bats that are fed and a bunch of bats that are unfed. And the question is, does an unfed bat try to get food from another unfed bat? Because if so, that means I can do the kinds of experiment. But if every bat instantly knows, oh, you can't even feed me, so I'm not even going to bother trying to get food from you, that makes it really hard to assess this cheating. And essentially what I got as an answer was that unfed bats do try to get fed by other unfed bats. You'll have two unfed bats both licking each other's mouths for a while, but they eventually figure out that they can't share food with each other, or that they're refusing. And it's unclear to me whether they know they can't or whether they just know they won't. So trying to tease apart can't from won't, I haven't thought of a way to do that without affecting some other feature, right? So I can make a bat sick. It's not going to share food probably with higher probability, but then you've got other things going on with that bat. So the other way to think about cheating is just having a less cooperative individual, which is not a cheater in the narrow sense of choosing not to feed, but is a cheater in the broader evolutionary sense of just a worse partner, a less cooperative partner, and testing whether bats will preferentially not form relationships with bats that are worse reciprocators for any reason, that they just repeatedly never have blood to give you when you have blood to give. That's the experiment we're doing right now in Panama.
Yeah, so that's related. But what I was suggesting is, so I mean, one argument that's been made about friendship, both in non-human primates and in humans, is that that there's bookkeeping with acquaintances, but not with friends, right? That what friendship does is it smooths out the stochastic noise in the ability to reciprocate, and so you don't keep track on a careful basis once you have that established relationship. And what my suggestion was not partner choice initially, but once relationships exist, if you turn a cooperator into a cheater, what's the buffer, right? That is, how much forgiveness is there before the partner says, oh, wait a minute, you're defecting now.
Yeah, so we are also doing that experiment. So we've got both experiments in plan. So we've got the partner choice experiment, which is to try to nudge their relationships as they're forming. And then we're doing a partner switching experiment. And that I'm going to try to do on campus, because I don't know how long this experiment's going to take. And a lot of this is logistically difficult because you can't repeatedly fast them too often, which means you can only get data from a bat like every week. So these relationships are going to have to be drawn out over a long period of time. So that's the partner switching experiment. We're going to map out what are the relationships and then try to shift them around subtly. But yeah, we haven't even started that one yet. We don't even have the bats on campus. They're supposed to come this summer. They were supposed to come a couple summers ago, but obviously everything's terrible right now. It's hard to do anything.
Yeah, I understood. Well, very cool. Thank you.
All right. Just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, feel free, use the raise hand feature. I had a question. I really appreciated, Gerry, the theoretical stuff that you said, especially at the beginning of the talk about expanding possibilities for how cooperation might work beyond the sort of old ones that many of us learned in grad school. I was really interested, and this is maybe a speculative question, and going to the experiments that you just described and you said are ongoing, the I guess you'd call them forced affiliation experiments. It seems to me that there could be several mechanisms that could explain that. I mean, in the sort of proximate ultimate continuum, right? From sort of like mere familiarity to creating fitness interdependence. I mean, I was thinking about the case in humans, right? Because I imagine if you go to kindergarten together with somebody in humans, well, you said there was dorm data for this. You're probably going to end up being more likely to be friends later on. And then I would guess that if your kindergarten class size was 3, that would make it even more probable that you're going to be with that person later in life. And I could think of a variety of ways that might work, like shared common ground. You're going to have better coordination abilities. Your fates are shared to a greater degree. So do you have any thoughts on that or ways of teasing that out?
Yeah, I want to write this like conceptual review paper on this topic, because there is like all these scattered ideas about it and data on this idea of like, how do strangers become friends? One interesting thing, it's too much to maybe say, there's just a whole bunch of different ideas, but one of them that's quite interesting is the idea of whether the valence of the experience. So the fact these bats were probably extremely stressed when we put them into these little cages trapped with other bats. One idea is that this actually could cause the bats to be more bonded because they have a shared negative experience. It's like individuals going to war together or something, and there's this like stressor. The other idea is that via operant conditioning, that it's going to make it harder for them to form a relationship because they're going to associate this other individual with a negative experience. So I think that's an interesting one to think about, is like, how does the nature of the experience? But then again, it could be there's so much to tease out just in terms of like whether it's just being forced together in proximity, or whether it's all of the little interactions that are happening in that window of time. I mean, we have to disentangle that as well. And
that's
so
great. I mean, it also means, because is it in the experiment they're actually like helping each other through trauma then, right, in a certain sense,
Yeah, as we didn't, I don't know if I mentioned this, but we did actually fast them through all of this. We didn't have enough food sharing data to actually analyze food sharing, but there was the other thing that was the other reason we didn't really look at food sharing is that there was a lot of begging that was not food sharing. So there was a lot of individuals licking each other's mouths, but nobody's changing weight. So yeah.
Gotcha. Interesting.
But
Cool. Okay.
interdependence is a difficult one because it's really about whether the animals perceive this interdependence.
Yeah.
And the cues for that. We don't know what that is. I mean,
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, even in people, that would be hard to study, even though you can ask them things.
Yeah, it's like another example of why, this just being so much more difficult is if you just look at the amount of evidence for kin selection, it's huge, but you look at the amount of evidence for the mechanisms of kin recognition, it's much smaller. We know much less about how animals actually identify their kin, but there's tons of studies showing that there's correlations with kinship. And I think it's the same thing with this evidence for reciprocity, where what exactly are the actual pieces of information that they're using to make these decisions? I don't think we really know.
Yep. Okay, we have a couple questions. Maybe Sasha first and then Susan.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering so I am interested in play behavior in primates, and I was just wondering, I guess your thoughts about play as a form of reciprocity. I was super interested in the study you were talking about where grooming like preceded food sharing. So I guess one question is like, how do you see, like, is there any mechanism you speculate about for how bond in one domain of behavior will translate into bond in the other domain? I mean, presumably this has to do with testing whether your partner is going to reciprocate properly. But I was wondering about that, like sort of the mechanism behind that. And then also just like, if you have any thoughts about play, like as maybe a precursor to grooming, like maybe I don't know if young vampire bats play with each other, but it strikes me as just like one of the very first behavioral domains that a lot of mammals learn how to reciprocate behavior.
Yeah, I think they're playful when they're young. And this is something I haven't paid that much attention to, but some of my interns have just been making these clips of bats doing funny things, and I realized like this is really valuable stuff. They're sending me these clips of like a bat that's like hanging upside down. And these are like the young bats predominantly that do this, and then like putting itself like through its hind limbs, and so it's like doing somersaults. So it's like hooking its thumbs, and then it hooks its limbs, and then it like puts its head. This is like one thing, or other ones that'll just be jumping on each other. The young bats also, if you put a novel object, like you put a boot in the flight cage, all the young bats come down and jump all over the boot and interact with it. The adults don't mess with it. And this is like it just doesn't, you can do this repeatedly. It's a very strong, obvious thing that the young bats are very exploratory and interact with any kind of new thing in their environment compared to the adults. I haven't thought about how that, if they're sort of building up in a reciprocal fashion social interactions through this play. Haven't really looked at that.
I guess that would be more like play fighting than so like object play. Just thinking like, I guess my only comparison is primates, but I don't know if vampire bats play wrestle or something like that, where you need to have like a reciprocal partner who's willing to.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if they did, but I just really haven't studied it that much. I mean, the younger bats, I just don't know them as well, because we tend to ignore them until they get to an age where we can fast them. But yeah, it would be an interesting thing to look at. I don't know if I have anything more to say about the mechanisms by which different interactions feed into each other. Like I think the clustering feeds into the grooming, and the grooming feeds into the sharing. I haven't shown clustering to grooming, but we have we have bats where I'm analyzing the data right now. I mean, we have bats where we had proximity loggers on them when we introduced them, and then we're seeing to see if that predicts the grooming. So I haven't I haven't linked all of the things to each other, but I think they definitely feed in, one feeds into the other. I'm not sure if I have more to say about it than that.
Well, thanks.
Okay, Susan.
Oh, you're muted.
I just want to say this is an amazing talk, and you've hit on all of the thorniest issues that have plagued primatologists forever. And except maybe one, which is, I think, the issue of whether something of a behavior is about bond testing or bond creation or bond maintenance, and we're always, Sasha and I are currently dealing with set of comments like that right now. And I get that in almost all of my papers. It's really hard to tell what that's all about. And I was wondering, first of all, if you've thought about that. Also, if you read this really nice book chapter by Hans Kummer in the book called Quest of the Sacred Baboon about the anatomy of a relationship. Have you seen that before?
No, I just learned about this person's work recently, which is really embarrassing because I mean, I am trying right now to get as big of a handle on the primatology literature as I can, but it's so vast, and I had somehow missed a
remarkable job. It was a great review. I mean, I don't think most primatologists would have done as good a review of our problems as you just did in this talk. So, but this is a remarkable chapter, and I think you should look at it.
Let me write it down. I mean, someone told me about a paper he wrote on development of new relationships in these captive primates that had been put together. And I said, where was that published? And it was like in Proceedings of the International Journal of a Conference. I was like, what? How is that not it was like a 1974 paper, and I eventually got my hands on it. And actually, the person sent it to me. She sent it to me, and I just thought, I can't believe I missed this. But it's something that I'm.
But that book chapter describes that same body of work.
Let me write that down. That's extremely helpful. What was it called again?
It's In Quest of the Sacred Baboon. It's out of print, but you can still get it on Amazon used books. And the chapter I think you would like most is called Anatomy of a Relationship. And it is talking about putting these relationships together. And he documents every little building block, the order in which they do the behaviors. And as you said, building up from the low cost to the high cost behaviors. And they do a lot of really strange rituals, which are presumably bond tests and greetings. And so it's really, there's a lot to think about in there. You know, there's nothing so fancy about the methods, but it's very well thought out. So I think you would like that a lot. I was also wondering, so envious of your ability to manipulate your bats. I study capuchin monkeys, and they have zero tolerance for people meddling in their lives. So there's no way I could do the kinds of things you do. Or wouldn't feel comfortable. Like I wouldn't actually feel comfortable doing Hans Kummer style science either. He's, in fact, I think by the end of his career, he wasn't comfortable doing that either. But because our organisms are just, they're just different. And like I said, hold grudges, don't forgive anything you do to them either. And so I'm pretty much stuck with doing long-term observational things. I noticed, though I have not read your papers, I just looked at your website a few minutes before the talk, that you've done some interesting social network work with permutations and hypothesis testing. Do you think that there is any hope for us primatologists who cannot experimentally manipulate all of this in trying to find useful things by analyzing our long-term data, particularly developmental data? So, I can't pull these animals apart and do that kind of experiment. But we do have, for example, a longitudinal data set for the past 20 years following cohorts and seeing how these relationships unfold as the individuals develop, which I think probably could provide some of the similar kinds of insights that you're getting from assembling new colonies, though they're cognitively not as well developed either. So that's a complicating factor.
I think there's an immense amount of insight to be drawn from long-term data sets in terms of there's such a huge development in just analysis of networks, social networks, and in particular, using essentially like an agent-based model to basically simulate all the things that would have happened under different hypotheses. So if the animals were using these strategies, you can keep the structure of your data very similar, but basically simulate over time how the relationship trajectory should look. And then comparing these expected networks with observed networks. I feel like there's a ton of things like that to be done with these data sets that may have been analyzed using much less powerful techniques. And so I think there's a ton of stuff that can be gained from applying more powerful computation-based analyses to network data, because network data is just it's so difficult to analyze for two reasons. First, because it defies all of the rules of normal data analysis, because nothing's independent of anything. And second, the people who analyze networks don't agree on how to best analyze them. So you've got all these methods from the social sciences that people have developed, which actually are not as useful as people think. It's a very common mistake that graduate students have social network data, and then they go to somebody who studies like gene regulation networks or human networks, and then says, I want to apply these same analyses to my data. But the problem is that human networks are often based on things like Facebook, like social media or surveys, where every edge in the network is 100% accurate. Like when this individual says, that's my best friend, that really is their best friend. Animal networks, there's a lot of uncertainty in the edges of the network. So what you really have is like a sample, often a surprisingly undersampled sample of the network. And so you can't apply these methods that start with a network as fact and move from there. You have to go back to the original data, construct all the different possible networks that could exist, make inferences to the network, and then make inferences from the network to the things you want to know about. There's essentially two different.
I feel like I have the opposite impression, is that most of the human networks have crappy data and they have to fit a lot more filling in. I mean, it depends on the animal behavior study, of course, how much
well,
done, but
I guess I'm thinking of the human networks, which are based just on people telling you what their network is.
But then you're assuming that they know accurately what their network is. But yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, it depends on whether your network is preferences or actual behaviors, right? A lot of times what we're trying to do is actually understand the animals' preferences for each other, and we're inferring that from the behaviors. And so what's nice with humans, you go straight to preferences. But the other thing, okay, what I was going to say, sorry, I'll just say this because I think it's so important, and it's pretty recent, and I don't know if, just in case anyone's interested in networks, there's this Bayesian network analysis preprint that came out like last week or something from the group that's like Dan Franks, Lauren Brent, who's a primatologist, Jordan Hart is the PhD student who wrote the paper. But that's a very promising approach because it does this thing of taking the uncertainty in the data and fitting that into the network. So basically puts a confidence interval on every edge. That is a very promising approach. And the other approach, which people have used, is these permutations or agent-based, basically a resampling approach to try to make different possible networks. I think those are the two approaches that people should use if they have observational network data. I'll leave it at that, but yeah.
No, absolutely. I'm trying to solve problems in cultural evolution, cultural dynamics change in mind, because I collect a lot of these weird things you described in bats. I've been meticulously documenting innovations and transmission of these over 30 years. And same issues apply here of trying to use network-based diffusion or something like that, and have different time periods, and also take agent-based models and make predictions based on formal theory about cultural evolution, and then see how it plays out in the data. So similar can of worms. But yeah, I was interested. I saw that you were in the sort of Damien Farine camp of social network analysis. And then I know that the Richard McElrath group, MPI group, has this kind of different approach, and it is more Bayesian and a little more like what you just described, though I haven't seen this paper that you is this 2022 paper, like last week, that I should be looking for?
The Hart, yeah, it's not published yet. It's a preprint, and they're gathering data on it. But this is something I want to clarify, because we've been discussing this. There's this, one of the things I'm trying to not let happen is in the network analysis world, we're right on the verge of starting to have camps, and I really don't want to have camps. So one of the problems with the cooperation literature is that we have these camps. So there are these people argue with each other, and everyone disagrees and gets further apart. And I feel like we're on the verge of that with social network analysis, because people have their favorite ways of analyzing these networks. What we really need to do is just do some simulations and then have people analyze these networks in all the different ways and try to get a sense of what are the pros and cons of different methods. But I would say that the Richard McElrath Bayesian approach of just really estimating well, like making a model that works with the data and estimating all the effect sizes very precisely, that is clearly the superior approach if people can get it to work. Like that's the thing that's missing, I think, is I don't think anyone has developed it to the point where it's like, yeah, here, this is what you do with your data in order to estimate these parameters very well, rather than just using a permutation test, which is just going to give you a p-value. And we all know the problems with just, using p-values for inferences. But it wasn't until this package was released that anyone had really said, well, here's how you do it. Here's how to do it in a way that carries the uncertainty through the network. So I think I haven't used it yet. I haven't tried it out, but I think that's the most exciting new development. And if you
I
want
think about that. I haven't seen that. So yeah, I might email you about that if I can't find it. Thanks. It was just a wonderful talk.
oh, thanks.
All right. We're nearing the end of our time. Do we have one more question or? Anne, go for it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed learning about your work today. Thank you so much. Because I study human vocalization, I was curious about the vocalization work that you really briefly touched on. And I was wondering if there's anything more, if you had a few more minutes, that you would have said or would have described about what you're trying to do there.
Just that the issue for us has been automating the measurement of the calls and extracting all of the parameters from them. But basically, we have this huge call library over 10 years measuring all these bats. And what we want to do is just look at, is there kinship signatures? Is it possible for unfamiliar kin to recognize each other through calls? And is there vocal convergence within groups? And then what we would hope to move into is like playback experiments. I'm also, sorry, last thing I'll say, I'm really interested in this idea of whether the bats are completely aware of every other bat around them just from the echolocation calls that they're emitting all the time, or if they really need to like investigate their social environment, like you in the dark with a flashlight shining on each person sequentially, versus whether vampire bats have a hyper awareness of their social environment where they could just 360 degrees know everyone around them instantly. That's something I want to get into, but we don't know.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah, good luck.
Yeah, super cool. All right. Well, thank you, Gerry, once again for a great talk and for coming to visit us. Good to see you all. Let's give Gerry a round of applause for his talk.
Thank you so much.